This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of World to Win. I want to welcome all of our new subscribers today. Hello, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and like our page on Facebook, and also don't forget to click the bell so that you get notified when we go live. The show today has a dual theme that I think is going to be really interesting for everyone. So we have the part of kind of like world in revolt. We're going to hear from Poland and from Israel, Palestine, where historic mass movements are taking place right now. And we're also going to chat a little bit about some of the mass movements taking place on all continents around the world right now. It's a really exciting time. But also we have a time of crisis and conflict as well for the capitalist elite. So we'll be discussing the situation of heightened tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, and also the so-called, peace process, or what's being branded as a peace process between the Israeli state and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan. So also at the end, we obviously are going to go to the shout out of the week, and we also have a couple of really cool announcements. So stay with us for that too. So I want to welcome my co-host. How are you doing, Toya?
I'm good, Yaara. How's it going?
Great.
So let's get started. We're gonna talk with Nikos in Greece. I know everyone was excited to hear about the victory, against Golden Dawn, which we will get to. I think our viewers definitely want to hear from you about, everything that's going on there. But first, we have a lot going on in the area in regards to, clashes and, a little bit outside of Greece, but in Armenia and Azerbaijan. And just, this is kind of a theme we're seeing around the world, but specifically in your area, can you talk about the situation there, what powers are involved, and what the competing interests are in regards to this conflict we're seeing with the extraction of natural resources and fossil fuels?
Yeah. Our area was never an area where we had peace and calm. There was always conflicts and clashes between different competing capitalist interests. So, and especially in the Aegean Sea, the conflict between Greece and Turkey is not something new. It's something that has gone on for decades. But the new thing now is that they have found important natural gas reserves under the East Mediterranean. So this created a whole new situation in the area, in which, of course, Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus are in the center of it, but also other powers are involved, Egypt, Israel, Italy, but also the big imperialist powers. So France, the USA, they're all scrambling for these new resources that are found in the area. So it's a battle for these resources, but it's also a battle for the domination. So Turkey wants to play a more enhanced role after a bit of what we see from US imperialism, that it's trying to disengage from the area, and Turkey wants to play a more important role there. Greece is in the axis of the EU and the USA, so it wants to help those interests. So there's a big clash of interest there. It's not about, we can have a big discussion on what is happening with the continental shelf and the exclusive economic zones, but we're not going to go into this now. What I think people who see us should know is that there are a material clash of interest between different ruling classes in the area, and that's what they're fighting for. And we should say that the situation is really dangerous. We had in Greece and Turkey, we had the fleets facing each other for days, and this still isn't over. It's like what we say, the army is with the trigger in his hands. So everybody's fearing what this could lead to. And it actually led to, we had a clash of two battleships, not with arms, but they clash with each other. So the situation is really dangerous. It's not the most likely scenario is not that we're going into war. General war is not winnable by any of the powers at this stage. But the tension, the nationalist tension, is really building, and this is very dangerous for the peoples of the area.
Thanks so much. And what you said actually leads to another question, because you talked about, this, inter-imperialist conflict and what's happening, kind of above people who are on the ground having to deal with the situations. But can you speak a little bit to, environmental wise, what the ramifications are for extracting these gases? I've, read about a pipeline and stuff. And so, in regards to the environment and the people who live in this area, what are the ramifications and what does this mean?
In general, capitalism is a system that is built on aggressiveness. So it's aggressiveness towards other capitalist power that we see in the area, but also aggressiveness towards the environment. So we now have this idea that natural gas is more environmental friendly than oil. So they're building up to that. So we found natural gas, and this is better for the environment, which is totally not true. In a way that it is true that that natural gas concerning carbon dioxide has less emissions than oil, but at the same time it has more methane, which if you take climate change, methane is more dangerous for climate change than carbon dioxide. So it's not an environmental friendly, it's still a fossil fuel. There's still limited resources on that. And also you should take account that this area is a seismic prone area. So we have a lot of earthquakes, and these earthquakes can create accidents. That there were accidents in oil rigs, but also in natural gas rigs. So these accidents can create a very damaging environment for the whole of the area. And also you should take account that this area is based on a lot in tourism. So this can create a lot of also economic ramifications for the people in Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. So we believe that these fossil fuels should be left on the ground, and there's an initiative on that. And we believe that there should be no extraction at all. We should be channeled to different energy resources, renewable energy resources. So, but also this should be made in a context, because also in the renewable energy sector, there are interests which make them work for the capitalists and not for the environment. But we should all take this into account, because they are trying to lead us to war. They're making us pay a lot of an arms race. Greece and Turkey are one of the top countries on NATO on arms expenditure, if you compare it to their GDPs. So they're making us go to war. They're making us pay a lot of money for the for this arm race, to make extractions that are dangerous for the environment, and also that foreign multinationals will gain out of them. So the local people will not gain anything out of this. So it's a situation that we think we should fight against this whole situation that is getting in the area.
I mean, you're totally right. They're always trying to portray natural gas as being clean as opposed to oil. And we know that this isn't true. And we know that we have alternatives to power our society. So what would you say to people who are watching this that want to support the struggle? And like, what can the working class do internationally to help build this movement? We've seen youth climate marches, across the world over the past few years, but, what can workers and youth do to help support the struggle?
I want to talk about this initiative that is going on in the area around, there are 68 environmental organizations, mainly from Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus at the moment, that have signed the declaration, which says no to war, no to extraction, no to climate change, and they're taking initiatives in that direction. And this is, I think, the path we should move to, because in general, in the area, the left has important forces, both in Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, and also other countries in the area. But the official parties, the main parties of the left, and the trade union leaders do not take initiatives or do not fight against this national rise. We see some of them at tail end our national ruling classes, respectively, and some of them just don't take initiatives on this issue. So there are 68 environmental organizations now that have made a common declaration, and we're discussing now how we move forward with this initiative. We could do a lot of common things together and break this nationalist tension that has been imposed to our countries. So this is what is happening now. And if we move towards this direction, we can also pressure the other forces of the left, because if the left parties, the big left parties in all our countries wanted actually to do things, they could do a lot of things to break this nationalist mood. They could do joint strikes, joint meetings, and also joint struggles. There are a lot of common problems that face the people of East Mediterranean, but also of the Aegean Sea, and we could do a lot to break this mood that has been trying to impose to us. So I call to everybody out there to see about this initiative and support it in any way they can, because I think it's important to make joint struggle of the peoples, because the working class and the popular strata are the only ones that can really break this deadlock that we are in the Aegean Sea at this moment.
Thanks so much. I have one last question. I'm really excited to be able to actually talk to you about this grand victory that we saw in Greece against the fascist organization Golden Dawn. I mean, can you just tell us, how does it feel right now to be in Greece, having this huge victory, and you are an anti-fascist? How does it feel? How do the people feel?
Well, yeah, I could just answer with one word. It feels great. We had this victory. It's a huge victory. It's an important victory, and I believe not only for Greece. This goes for the whole of Europe, because Golden Dawn was one of the most successful neo-Nazi parties all over Europe. And with our struggle, we achieved to dismantle this tool that they had in their hand. And this is an important thing. I mean, I don't want to make the impression that fascism is generally dead in Greece or anywhere else, but they had this very important tool in their hands. They had a lot of MPs, a lot of money, offices everywhere, death squads that attacked left people, immigrants, and so on. So this all is now gone. We see a lot of happy faces at this moment in time in Greece. The demo outside the court the day that the verdict was going to be announced was huge. It was huge also in other cities, and you could actually see smiling faces, which in Greece, I don't know if people know the situation, but after the defeat and the capitulation of Syriza, there's a lot of disappointment in the area. So after a lot of time, you could see happy faces, and people felt that we actually did it. We actually achieved to put them in jail. And the important on this decision was not only the verdict, but it was actually that the penalties were not suspended, because they were fighting for that. They could get penalties, but the penalties could be suspended and they could be out of jail. But this also, we fought against this, and this also didn't. They didn't achieve that, so they're now in jail. The offices are closing everywhere. They cannot do a public meeting anywhere. So Golden Dawn is now dead. So this is very important for us. You have to take account that this was a decades-long struggle. It started in the 80s, and in general, in Greece, the far right had very close ties with the establishment, the deep state, as we say. So it was a decades-long struggle. It took 3 people murdered. It was not only the singer Pavlos Fissas, but it was also Saksat Lukman, who was a worker, and also Petrit Zilfe, who was also an immigrant worker. They killed 3 people. They attacked lots of demonstrations, left-wing people. A lot of people ended up in the hospital with knives, even guns. So this was an important victory, and we should say that the struggle actually made a difference on that. It was if it was left to the judges, they would be out now. But the struggle actually played a role in this, and we're really happy for this, and we want this example to be multiplied in other countries also. So we're really happy about that.
Congratulations. It's such a huge victory. And thank you so much for coming on today to talk to us about it.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you again, Nikos, for coming on the show with us today. And for anyone who's in Greece or Cyprus that wants to get involved with our organization, what would you say to them?
Okay, I'm going to say that in Greek, and I'm going to say, θέλουμε όλοι οι άνθρωποι που παλεύουν, που δίνουν αυτό τον κοινό αγώνα μαζί μας, να έρθουν σε επαφή, να δώσουμε μαζί αυτή τη μάχη για να αλλάξουμε τον κόσμο και να χτίσουμε την επαναστατική αριστερά. Στο link που βλέπετε από κάτω, ελάτε σε επαφή μαζί μας να δώσουμε μαζί αυτό τον αγώνα.
Thanks so much, Nikos. Yeah. Talk to you later.
Thank you so much, Nikos. It's so good to hear about this. Now I want to move slightly south from the Eastern Mediterranean into the Middle East, and specifically a place that is very close to my heart because, well, I'm from there, Israel and Palestine. It seems like the region there is never quiet, but we've had a few particularly crazy months, I think, with Trump's deal of the century and the looming annexation of about a third of the West Bank by the Israeli state, which seems to have been put on hold, which is, according to Netanyahu, on hold or fully blocked, which is according to the United Arab Emirates bin Zayed, thanks to the so-called peace agreement between the Israeli state and the UAE and Bahrain. Now we have Yasha from Socialist Struggle, which is our sister organization in Israel and Palestine, to help us understand a little bit more about what's happening there. So Yasha, why was it so important for the Netanyahu government to start this peace process now? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that neither the UAE nor Bahrain have ever been in active war with the Israeli state ever. So why now?
No, there was no active war, of course, but there was also no diplomatic relationships. And this process of normalization is a shift for the region, and it's happening in a very particular moment of increased tensions and clashes, increased regional crisis, economical, social crises, environmental crises, and actually, Nikos was speaking about the battle over the gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, and here you can see that Israel and the United Arab Emirates are fighting on the same side of this gas battle against the regime of Erdogan. But obviously, the most central rivalry in the region is with the Iranian regime. There was already a process going on for some years, especially under Trump administration, when Netanyahu was closing ties the pro-imperialist monarchies in the region to assist this fight. His rivalry with the Iranian regime, but also to whitewash the continuation of the occupation in Palestine, the siege on Gaza, the expansion of colonial settlements. Therefore, we see this peace propaganda that are trying to actually cover up the real substance of those accords, of those agreements in a particularly cynical way. I mean, for Netanyahu and also for Trump, it is also the question of the timing. You know, it's quite important for them to pose now as peacemakers, like Trump needs this just before the elections in a few days. And if you saw the phone call he had with Benjamin Netanyahu, and because there is nothing progressive in those accords, and actually the term peace here is not appropriate. It's a cynical agreement that are actually in the long term install much more tensions in the region. And I want just to say one more brief point. A few days ago, U.S. ambassador to Israel announced that U.S. and Israel scientific cooperation will from now on expand to Israeli institutions in the colonial settlements. Yes? So how this come along with those accords? And the truth is, there is no contradiction. This is just the two sides of the same coin, because those agreements, they are normalizing not only the relations between those ruling classes, but also the ongoing occupation and expansion of colonial settlements. So here you have both of those things are just coming together in a few days' time.
Yeah, I think there's kind of like a sentiment of maybe like kind of a war is peace attitude. And when I watched the announcement on Israeli TV, alongside the announcement on the news, there were like notifications about missile attacks, and they were happening simultaneously. So like claiming that now there's peace in the Middle East, like, you know, we have an agreement with like diplomatic relations with the UAE, and now everyone's in the Middle East is gonna like sit down together and sing kumbaya and everything is fine and Israel is a great moral state. It's just ridiculous, you know. Like we know that the Israeli occupation is continuing in the West Bank, in Gaza, in the Palestinian territories, and like, you know, the horrific treatment of the Israeli state of Palestinians is not going to stop. So I was wondering, because recently we've had new developments with that when Sudan entered this agreement. So I was wondering, is that different to what's happening with the UAE?
It is in a way, but I just want to how the people of the Middle East feel about this agreement. So first of all, according to last survey, 90% of the Palestinians says they felt strongly negative about the agreement between the Emirates and Israel. Yeah, for the reason that you just described. And throughout the region, in the Arab states, these agreements are not popular because of the strong sentiments of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for national liberation and against the ongoing occupation and national oppression. And this is also the case in Sudan. So in a way, for the regime that is now in the process of internal struggle between processes of revolution and counter-revolution in Sudan, for this military civil regime to go on with this move is a gamble. Yeah, they're really gambling. And Hamdouk, who is the prime minister of the civil government, like just a few weeks ago, his position was to wait before they go forward with this official normalization, while what is quite obvious now in retrospective that the generals, the army, the tops of the army that hitchhiked the Sudanese revolution, they were in touch with the Israel regime and with Netanyahu for already quite a long time. And now, in the recent weeks, just before the US election, Netanyahu tried to broker this deal for them, particularly for the generals, with Trump, and it has some components to it, because the state of the Sudanese economy is obviously in a very bad shape, and they want to secure loans from the IMF. And for that, part of the thing is that they need Trump to agree to remove Sudan from a list of states that sponsor terrorism. That was part of the deal. And Trump asked very cynically, obviously, but he did that to pay money to the US, to pay compensation to the families that were victims of attacks that were perpetrated during the old dictatorship of Sudan. But also the normalization with Israel was part of this deal. So basically, the Sudanese administration, civil and military, they were blackmailed to go ahead with this so-called peace process. Have you ever seen a peace process that some side on it should be blackmailed to enter that? So this is also very telling and revealing about the nature of things. And I want to stress further the point that this process is not the product of the revolution in Sudan, but the product of the counter-revolution in Sudan. The fact that the generals now have the upper hand, that's what allowed them to go ahead with this move that inside the Sudanese society would be very unpopular because of the strong sentiment of solidarity with the Palestinian masses that I just mentioned at the start of my talk.
Yeah, thank you, Ash. I think this really explains it. I also think, like the situation in Sudan is quite different to the one in the UAE, just because, first of all, they have a majority, in the UAE, there's a lot of people who aren't actually citizens in the country. So the kind of the regime has a lot more free hand to do what they want, even though obviously there's still a lot of people who disagree or oppose this agreement. I also wanted to ask you something that I've seen a lot in the news to do with the agreement with Sudan, which was the issue of Sudanese refugees in the within the borders of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard that part of this agreement was kind of sending back to the death, most likely, a lot of refugees. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. It's actually deportation. This is what it means. Yeah. So, and the Sudanese community in Israel, they are basically asylum seekers, but they are not recognized by the state as refugees. And there is harsh racist incitement against them that the Netanyahu regime is leading for already some years. And this includes also divide and rule between those refugees and the most impoverished communities in Israel. This is in my area, in my neighborhood, in South Tel Aviv. I have the Sudanese neighbors, and this place is with very scattered resources and neglected infrastructure. And what the Israeli regime, like the government, but also the municipality here is doing, they're trying to blame all those social problems in the neighborhood on the Sudanese refugees. And now with this agreement, they try to present the fact that they can deport those refugees as another achievement of Netanyahu's great diplomacy. Obviously, we will resist it, fight against it, organize against it, but then it's just another another component that shed light on the nature of the agreement that we are speaking about.
Yeah, and I think, the cynical reason, the very cynical reasons behind these agreements with the UAE and Bahrain, whether it's because of, the weapons or support around the area and the economy, and with Sudan, there's just to look at us how peaceful we are, while at the same time continuing the brutal occupation of Palestinians, and also the horrible situation for Israeli Jews as well as Palestinians, is just ridiculous, and it's so cynical. And I think it leads nicely to talking about kind of the situation within Israel and Palestine right now. So we've seen mass protests all around the country fighting against Netanyahu, who, to everyone who doesn't know, has been prime minister for over 11 consecutive years now. So that's also after a shorter stint as prime minister in the 90s. So in fact, Netanyahu has been prime minister for most of my life, the vast majority of it. And I think another thing that is really interesting to see on how young people are going to fight against him. Some young people don't even remember a time when he was in office. So I think these protests are really impressive. And recently we've seen Netanyahu even try to restrict the right to protest under the guise of COVID, which has come to bite him in the back massively. Hopefully we can talk about this a little bit in a bit. So Yasha, can you tell us a little bit about the situation with COVID in Israel and Palestine at the moment? I know that there was a fairly successful early lockdown, but then we've seen a major second spike in the last few months. So much that the Israeli state became, I think, one of the first countries in the world to go into a second lockdown. So what's happening with that?
I mean, it's a huge crisis. Yeah, it's all over the world, like in all other countries, but even more so. It's a health crisis, it's an economical crisis, it's a social crisis, and it's all compound together. And I think that Netanyahu's regime is responsible for the total neglection and not readiness of the health system to tackle this pandemic in Israel. With lack of staff, lack of ICU beds, etc. But also he's responsible for the horrific situation in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and particularly in Gaza, when after 13 years of siege, the hospitals were on the verge of collapse already before the pandemic. And when there was a huge poverty and unemployment already before the pandemic. And what the pandemic and also the lockdowns, because like in the West Bank, in Gaza, I mean, there was lockdowns that was declared by the local Fatah and Hamas administrations. What this means is that families cannot bring literally food to the table. And inside Israel, within the green light, I mean, obviously Netanyahu is saying that the fact that Israel was the first state to announce second lockdown is a great achievement. It's like we are, like he's saying that like Israel is like one step ahead in corporation to other countries of the world, the first one to have the second wave, the first one to have the second lockdown. And there was also a survey in Israel, and around 60% of the people think that we are heading to a third lockdown in the winter. So this is tell you something about trust in government, because I mean the numbers of people hospitalized, they went down as the result of the second lockdown, no doubt about it. So there is less pressure on on hospitals, which is a good thing, but it's not the whole picture. It's only a very small part of the picture, because the whole picture is that there is like 1 million unemployed, which is somewhere between 15 to 20%. There is a huge economical crisis. There is a huge social crisis. And when you look at the pandemic itself, there was like a study by the one of the institutes, by Weizmann Institute in Israel, and they revealed that your chance to catch COVID if you live in one of the poorest towns and communities in Israel is 6 times higher compared to the richest towns and communities. And what is need to be taken into account is that also large part of the poorest communities in Israel is Palestinian communities of Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. But this crisis is also affect massively the Israeli Jews, and particularly Orthodox Jews, and there is also scapegoating and incitement against the poorest communities to blame them actually for the fact that there is a huge rates of COVID infection in their towns. So this is also part of how this government mismanaging the pandemic, of creating those prejudice and obstacles for a policy that can really pave a way forward for exit strategy out of this crisis.
Yeah, and I think, especially in the context of the fact that there have been 3 elections in Israel last year, and the only reason why there is a government right now is because it's kind of like this fake crisis government that allowed Netanyahu to be the prime minister again, even though the majority of people did not vote for him and did not want him there. And I think that also kind of brings us to the question of these mass protests. I know that Netanyahu is standing trial for corruption. And do you think that the mass movement there started, is it because of the corruption, or is it deeper than that?
Well, taking into account of what we said now about the health crisis, the economic crisis, the social crisis, I mean, obviously it's much deeper than that. But what we saw during the beginning of the pandemic in the spring, like half a year earlier, is that Netanyahu actually managed to maneuver and to establish a new government with a certain support among some layers of the population that were saying that in this kind of crisis, with this kind of pandemic, to have some kind of government is better than have no government. And this is also on the basis of shock and fears of what's going to happen next, etc. But then the support for Netanyahu went down from 56% approval for his tackling of the pandemic in March, in the spring, to only 27% now in September. And obviously, the change is not because of the corruption, because the corruption everything was known already before the elections. But it is particularly the health, economical, and social crisis that came to the fore. And I mean, there is no support for the unemployed. Almost. I mean, the unemployment benefits are very small in Israel. It's somewhere between 60% to 70% at best. And for people under the age of 28, it is even less than that. And there is a massive youth unemployment because the economy, particularly in cities like Tel Aviv, is based on, retails, hospitality, restaurants, pubs, tourism, etc., and all of this is gone, and there is no compensation. Yeah, let's put it frankly. I mean, because of the 10,000s that went out to the streets and also some strikes in some sectors, we can see a little bit more compensation money being given to some layers during the months of summer, but it's still not enough, and it's still nothing of what is needed. So, I mean, one of our slogans is that there is no health and no livelihood, and workers, particularly female workers, but also workers in general, are forced to choose between health and livelihood. But there is plenty of police brutality. There is plenty of fines for people that are not, following the COVID rules, etc. So the government policies is only to enforce it by force. There is a huge also crisis in society of violence against women and femicide. And part of this crisis is the fact that those authorities that should have taken care of this, like, social workers and different emergency centers, they are underfunded. Some of them are dependent only on donations. They don't receive the budgets, some of the budgets that the government already agreed to allocate to them, but they are like slow in giving this money because they are hopefully want to, not to do that, to save this money. And at the same time, there is huge resources that are being given, huge sums that are given to the biggest corporations in Israel, to the richest tycoons. So obviously, all of the class contradictions are also coming to the fore.
Yeah, I think it's like, there's so many reasons to go out in the streets. So it also makes sense that Netanyahu was freaking out a little bit and trying to restrict protests. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, he tried to use the second lockdown as a pretext to attack demonstrations. And he called the demonstrators that are gathering every Saturday for week after week inside of his official residency in Jerusalem as spreaders of COVID. And I mean, for one particular moment, it also seems that at the start of the second lockdown, this would be some public support for that, because some of the people were saying, yes, the situation is so bad that allowing demonstrations would be really dangerous in terms of pandemic. But then when Netanyahu doubled down on it, so it was the opposite reaction, with tens of thousands going to protest near their homes, because demonstrations were restricted to only 1 kilometer from the place that you are living, from your home. So people were having small protest pickets outside of their homes, inside the neighborhoods, in different junctions, like on bridges, etc. And in Tel Aviv, there was, by the end of the day, also marches of thousands of young people who were resisting those undemocratic attacks on the right to protest against the government that they are fed up with, who are trying so cynically to use the real threat and danger of corona to clamp down on democratic rights.
Thank you, Ash. I think it's so good to see how, even those restrictions were just pushing more people out in the streets, and there's a real rage amongst especially young people, but everyone in society wanting to just kick Netanyahu and kick the system out, which I think is great. Now, before we go, I have one little question for you, because, as an Israeli Jew who's living in the UK, we've seen loads of headlines basically blowing up here in the last few days about Jeremy Corbyn, who is the former leader of the Labour Party, and he was suspended from the Labour Party due to anti-Semitism. So have you heard about it? What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I would just say that Netanyahu is celebrating, yes. He would be very happy about this move, which is so cynical, because, obviously, Corbyn is not an anti-Semite, and he's an anti-racist campaigner for most of his life, for his political life. And the Labour right-wing leadership is using the very real issue of anti-Semitism in a very cynical way, because we need to stress that anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe and obviously in the USA with Trump administration, but particularly this is the case now with the corona and the pandemic, alongside with Islamophobia and xenophobia. And when this is the case, it is a huge attack to remove Corbyn for these reasons from the Labour Party. To suspend him is not only a huge attack on the left wing of the Labour Party, but also for the genuine struggle against anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also think, it pushes even, because the reason for the anti-Semitism, though they're saying, is criticism of the Israeli government, among other things. And I think that is ridiculous. See how many people, we're just talking about how many people are out on the streets fighting the Israeli government. So are all these Israeli Jews out on the streets against Netanyahu?
Yes. It is the criticism of the occupation and the oppression of the Palestinians, and the right wing in Israel is trying to make the case that any kind of criticism of the racist, brutal policies against the Palestinians is new anti-Semitism. This is what they call the new anti-Semitism. And now they are assisted in making this cynical point by the right-wing leadership of the Labour Party. So this should be resisted. It should be resisted here by socialists in Israel, in Palestine, but obviously also in England and UK.
So I want to ask you, Yasha, before we go, can you tell the people in Israel and Palestine what do they need to do in order to contact the organization and fight together with us?
Yeah, well, so obviously we are now involved in the protest movement against the Netanyahu government, and there is many different ideas, but in this movement of how to take the struggle forward, and we call for the socialists to get organized along with the labor movement, Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, to struggle for a socialist change against the occupation, against the rule of capital, for a real exit strategy out of these multiple crises that were only exacerbated against corona. And if you are looking at this video from our area, so just drop by to our website and contact with us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Yasha. Always great to speak.
Thank you for having me.
Now I want to move to another really exciting movement that's been going on around the world. Poland has been rocked by over a week of daily mass protests after a ruling by the Constitutional Court that would basically outlaw abortion in the case of fetal abnormalities. Now, in a country where access to abortion is already restricted, that would impose even more barriers for legal procedures, because we all know that when abortion is outlawed, it doesn't stop abortion, it just stops safe abortion. Now, this represents an outright assault on women's rights, denying essential healthcare to Polish women, and it's rooted in the reactionary and sexist ideas that women don't have the right to choose what they do with their bodies. So, of course, I know socialist feminists across the world are watching these events and standing in solidarity with Polish women, but also, drawing these conclusions and inspiration and lessons from the struggle in Poland. This is not the first time, even in the last 5 years, that these mass movements in Poland had to break out because of the regime. I think the international element is very clear against sexism and misogyny in your own countries as well. So today, we really want to draw out these lessons, and we're joined by socialist feminist Stefan, who is a member of the ISA, and you've been on the ground in Poland directly, intervening in this movement. So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on and kind of what's led to these mass demonstrations?
So, as you said, the ruling by the Constitutional Tribunal that fetus abnormalities is an unconstitutional reason to abort means that 96% of the legal abortion that take place in Poland now will be now illegal, knowing that there is also up to 200,000 abortions every year that are illegal or done abroad. They had already tried to impose such a ruling in 2016, not the Constitutional Tribunal, but the Conservatives. And as you mentioned, there was then a huge women's movement and a women's strike that forced them to cancel this move. But since that, there has been a series of attacks against, or smaller attacks on reproductive rights. And this summer, we have also seen a rise of homophobic state propaganda and of homophobic attacks, which was met by resistance by the LGBTQI+ movement. So it's in this context that this new attack for a total ban of abortion basically is taking place. In 2016, we have seen a lot of new layers of young women and school students, which is unusual in Poland, taking the streets. And now in 2020, we can say that it's even extending to broader layers of the working class. There has been demonstrations in small towns and working class neighborhood where there hasn't been a demonstration for the last 30 years, and where the ruling Conservative Party, the PiS, had a majority. There has been protests in workplaces. Tram workers, bus workers have held protests on their workplaces. Hospitals workers too. Every day I see new examples of workplaces where a protest in favor of abortion rights has taken place, and the support for the PiS is dropping considerably. And we can say that from the beginning of the movement, the aspirations of the movements have really broadened from the feminist question to becoming a real anti-government movements. There are a lot of demands to overthrow the government and so on. But there is also but of course the question of abortion rights is still very present, and people do not want the compromise anymore that allows us to abort only in case of fetal abnormalities, if our health is in danger, or if the pregnancy is the result of a crime. People do not want this compromise anymore. They are ready to fight for abortion on demand.
That's brilliant. And I think also seeing kind of from outside all the slogans, I think one really stands out, which is I wish I could abort the government, which I think really shows the political character that you're talking about, and about how people are making these connections. It's not just the court. It's not it's something a lot deeper than that. And I think across Eastern Europe and to some extent across the world as well, we've seen the growth of the right, the growth of the far right on the streets, but also in government. So do you think this movement represents kind of a challenge to this rule?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, the government is in a bad position now, and they know it. There are some cracks in the regime already. They had an internal conflict recently around very secondary issues regarding animal rights anyway. And they know that the situation is dangerous for them. and they are having a big repressive reaction to that. They have implicitly called the fascists to defend the churches against the protesters. They have sent the armies in the street. The prosecutors have announced that anyone who calls for a demonstration of more than 5 persons will be prosecuted and could end up to 8 years in prison. And everyone who answers to the call to demonstrate could also be prosecuted under the pretext of the pandemic situation. And we can, as I was saying, the peace is losing its base of support in the society. Solidarność, the trade union, has unfortunately and shamefully called to join the fascists in the defense of the church. And but in the rank and file of Solidarność, there are a lot of people who actually want to fight for women's rights. So what the leadership of this conservative union is doing do not reflect its basis, and they are losing ground. And there are even some hooligans, even if they are in a minority, who are not defending women's rights, when it's usually they're usually a place of recruitment for the far right. And I just read, for example, that a retired lieutenant called the cops not to repress the women's movement. So the peace is in a very bad situation right now, but that the question of what we replace the peace with and is paused now, and it also means that we will face a very strong repression in the coming days.
I think that is incredible, insane to hear what how the government is reacting to these protests. And I was wondering, especially you mentioned a little bit about the pandemic, and obviously there's been a massive, one of the main reasons why they've decided to launch the attack now is because of COVID, and because they thought they would kind of not let people go on the streets. But we've seen that didn't work that well. So I was wondering, because generally the COVID crisis we've seen affecting women disproportionately, and especially working class women around the world, and with childcare, with schools being closed, but generally also more likely to be sacked and become unemployed and less likely to find a job. So I was wondering if that's had any effect in Poland, and specifically on these protests.
Yes, I think that because of this pandemic, a lot of anger has been bottling up in women and in the society in general. And actually, a lot of people were already angry at the government for the way it managed the pandemic crisis before that. For example, in the last spring, the government even tried to organize the elections by the post office, and there was a strike committee of the postal workers organized by one of our comrades, who was fighting these attempts, which would make the elections totally undemocratic. And now this strike committee has taken the defense of women. The nurses have suffered a lot of the cuts that happened in the previous years during this pandemics. Women have been sacked from precarious jobs, or had to take care of children while working in the same time from home. So as you say, the situation has been worse for women. So I think all this indeed explains why such a huge movement of so widespread in the working class is taking place. But as I was saying, they are using the COVID as a pretext for more repression. But we are countering that by saying that, because, as you say, the government chose this date to make this attack, they are responsible for everyone who will be infected and who will die as a result of the protests. And just like they are responsible for everyone who died from the ban of abortions, because it is a case that happens in countries where abortion is not legal on demand.
Yeah, I think that really connects, I think, to the impact that the women's movement, and specifically the pro-abortion movement in Poland in 2016 had internationally. I think, you know, we've seen those protests spread around the world, and that also comes in the context of heightened women's struggle generally, you know, with the Me Too movement, with a lot of workers like striking against sexual harassment. You had a general strike for International Women's Day in the Spanish state in 2017 that had, you know, 6 million people, and, you know, the mass movements of women all around the world. And I wanted to hear, obviously Poland was major in that movement 4 years ago. I was wondering, because I know that there was a strike this week. I was wondering, did the Polish movement, was it affected by kind of the international backdrop of all of these workers' struggles and all of these women's struggles? And how do you think, like, what lessons did this movement learn from the international movement, and like what the international movement can learn from the struggle in Poland?
Yeah, I think generally that every international movement at some point has an influence on Poland. The Polish women have really been looking to the global movement as a source of inspiration, and actually, especially in Ireland, where abortion rights was secured several years ago. We ran some successful public meeting with Rosa Ireland in the past, and women are really eager to know what are what difficulties women are facing in other countries, and how they fight for their rights, and how the movement can continue. And in return, I see that there is a lot of support from everywhere in the world. I've seen there are protest actions in Sweden, Belgium, Ireland, Austria, the UK, and so on. And all this international pressure can help, both because it helps boosting the morale of women who are fighting on the ground, but also, especially with the rise of repression, it could help to have some international pressure on Polish government.
And what do you think that, like, what needs to happen to sustain this movement, you know, like to knock back the right, and also win, like you said, not just like not a backlash on abortion, but also win real abortion rights for women in Poland? Like, what do you think the difference is between a socialist feminist approach that we're obviously pushing for and the liberal feminist approach?
Well, I would say that now there is the big question of the direction that this movement will take, because it is calling to overthrow the peace, but it doesn't know what to replace it with, and there is a big vacuum of the leadership that could be taken actually by the liberals. And if this is the case, there is a risk that the liberals will actually tone down the movement to just a defense of the compromise, instead of going towards the full abortion rights just for their political gains. As a socialist feminist, we are calling for a general strike, and for it to be called by the leaders of the unions. We have launched a petition for the leaders of the unions to actually call for a general strike. There is a huge potential for it. There are people who say that their co-workers in places like the rail works and so on are saying that they would be on strike if the unions had called one. So this huge potential exists. Unfortunately, the leadership of the unions are not yet organizing such an initiative. On the contrary, but there are locally or smaller unions who are actually siding with the protests, including the union August 80, and its minors branch has even come forward to officially back the protest. And August 80 said that they will defend anyone who is prosecuted because participation to the protest. So, as socialist feminists, we really have to organize it for it to become an independent struggle of the working class, for the trade union to take up the issue, to organize a general strike, because this would have the potential to block the economy. And we also have to answer the question of what to put forward instead of the peace, and to show that the women's struggle is linked with the fight against capitalism, and put the socialist question on the agenda.
Brilliant. So before you go, I want to ask you, first of all, what can women across the world who are watching this right now do to help the movement in Poland? And also, what can women in Poland do? How do they get in contact with you and support this movement with you?
Well, women in the world can join the protest actions that are already taking place, and they can contact their local ISA branch, because I know that there are comrades of ISA who want to organize more protests. And I invite women of Poland to go on the page of Rosa Polska to see the initiative we are taking, what we put forward in the strike, and to contact us so that we can help them organize and together try to push the unions to take a stand and put forward the socialist agenda in the women's strike.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I find it great to hear from someone who's on the ground in Poland. And I think I'm speaking for every woman and hopefully every man watching this saying, well done, solidarity. And we're hoping that this movement can really win abortion rights for Polish women.
So these have been some great interviews that we had today. It was really inspiring to hear the work, especially at the end, hearing about Poland. You know, as a woman, it's just to see other women hitting the streets and fighting for a right to protect our bodies. It's so inspiring. But we're seeing all of these mass movements across the entire world right now. It's like, you know, the year is coming to a close and we're in this pandemic, but people are fighting back. You know, we've seen things from Colombia to Indonesia. We talked about Thailand last week or the week before, Belarus. And then, you know, we had Andre on last week talking about Bolivia. But I think maybe if we just point out some of the not key struggles, but some of the big struggles that have happened. For example, Indonesia. Yaara, have you seen what's happened there?
Yeah, it's actually crazy, you know, like there was a 3-day general strike. I don't understand how this is not, like, you know, in the news more. I haven't seen it until like I genuinely looked for it. And 3-day general strike in the first week of October. And there were like hundreds of thousands protested and millions went on the strike against an omnibus mega package of 79 different anti-war worker and anti-environmental laws. Like, it's absolutely insane. And, you know, this was kind of like a package of laws that the government has passed through parliament earlier this month. And it was a culmination of a mass protest movement that's been going on for 6 months, for over 6 months now. And I think what's most like horrific to see is the brutal state repression that the protesters have faced. You know, thousands were arrested during the general strike, and there was kind of like an obvious increased militarization of the government. And like we've heard over and over and over again today, it all links back to this like new excuse that every government around the world suddenly has, which is COVID, you know, like trying to use it to normalize these new repressive measures. But still, people are going out and fighting against it. And I think, you know, you mentioned Thailand a little bit, and I think that is really interesting to see, because that movement there has also been going on like strong for a long time.
Yeah, it's been raging for a few weeks against the country's authoritarian regime. And Thailand's one of the, you know, few places in the world that still has a monarchy. But the protesters are really being driven by the youth, which I love to see. I know you love to see, Yaara. They've been demanding the fall of the government installed by a coup in 2014. And while recent years, we've seen anti-government protests in Thailand, this year's protest specifically is reaching a much higher level. And it's demanding more changes to the country's, you know, personnel. And the power and the wealth of the unelected monarchy, which, you know, sits above the political system, right? Because it is unelected. They have approved dozens of coups in the last decade. And this is being explicitly questioned for the first time, which it can't be overstated how, you know, the connection of mass movements across the world. But despite a major hike in state repression, hundreds of arrests of the movement are continuing to grow. And this week, the prime minister tried to appease the protesters by withdrawing some of the latest repressive measures. and the protesters' response was to not stop. Like, they're not giving in to that. And they actually presented him. Don't you love it? They're just like, yeah, no. And actually, we're going to give you a 3-day deadline to resign. It's just super inspiring, like what they've been able to do. Yaara, have you seen some of the tactics that the youth have picked up there?
Not really. What was happening?
Okay, so of course they're all over all of the social media apps, trying to communicate through that. But the government is doing these like lockdowns and trying to stop the use of internet, stop access to the internet in the protests. So they started using hand signals in the protests to communicate. I love it. Like, it's so clever. And then, you know how on Facebook they have like the emoticons where you can like or love, or because of COVID now we can care. Yeah. So they've been using those for people to poll what they want to do. So they're like, put this emoticon if you want this if you want that. Like, it's so easy and clever. And like these young, up and coming leaders are saying that the government thinks that they're arresting the leaders, and that's what's going to stop us. But we're all leaders. And I mean, this is just so inspiring, the self-sacrifice that these young people have.
I love it. And I really love how, there's this new Netflix thing, The Social Dilemma, about how, like Facebook is so horrible for everyone. And like, I think those kind of things show the potential of social media and like what it can do for people, like, because like they had this kind of like centrist underlying tone of we hate the extremists on both sides, but these movements can actually help topple like oppressive governments. It's amazing what the potential there. And of course they're trying to make a profit, but that just highlights even more the need for a socialist economy.
Exactly. And we're seeing a lot in the media right now about the use of social media. I mean, in the US, they're talking about bringing Facebook and Google up on these charges, and they're not being allowed to put forward any sort of political like articles, like they can't post political ads and stuff like that. But yeah, the youth are like, we're going to figure out a way to get through all of this. And they're also using a lot of the lessons and tactics that we saw in Hong Kong, which is very inspiring. These movements really do build off of each other. But what we've learned then, and we're learning now, and we will continue to learn, is that we need a revolutionary program to really bring forward these ideas. And I mean, we're seeing that play out right now in Chile. Last weekend, the crushing rejection of this constitution that was drawn up by Pinochet, which was the dictator from decades back. And I mean, this vote was huge, but it was clearly a victory won by the Chilean youth, the workers, the women, the indigenous people who started the revolt in 2019 over rising prices and police brutality. When I think about this, I remember that picture. Yaara, did you see that picture where it's like a statue and people are taking up over the statue? From far away, it looks like a mountain of people. It's so inspiring. But just a week prior to this referendum, tens of thousands were on the streets, showing that the referendum, which established a process to draw up a new constitution, it's not just going to like put people back to sleep. It's not like this is the end. So because of mass pressure, because of organization, because of mobilization from below, they were able to create a constituent assembly that's going to rewrite the new constitution. And so they have to keep fighting to make sure that the capitalist elite aren't able to, take back what it is that they've won. And we heard from Tefane in Poland about what the Polish women have done. And this in Chile is a huge, huge victory for the feminist movement, that this constituent assembly, Yaara, it has to be 50% women and 50% men to make sure that women have a say in what happens to their bodies. I mean, how inspiring is that?
It's so inspiring, and it's like, it's so ridiculous, that they still had basically a fascist constitution, and now they're making so much progress thanks to this movement on the ground. It's unbelievable. And I think that like all of these movements are just so inspiring. All of the ones that we're talking about today, we're talking about so many movements today. It's kind of like we could fit so many more if we just had more time. And it just shows how global this crisis that we're living through is. And I think, you know, we're living through a process of deglobalization generally. We're seeing countries fighting each other, nations fighting each other. But essentially, the working class all around the world understand that this is a global movement and this is a global crisis and a global system that's the reason for this crisis. And I think it's also acknowledged by, you know, the ones that are active in the protest, that like they have this real sense of internationalism. Like we talked about Poland a little bit, about how, you know, the protesters are looking to other places where abortion rights have been won, and other places where they haven't been won yet are looking to Poland. And I think learning from like our own experiences, from our own examples all around the world is so important. And I think the International Socialist Alternative really stands for this. We stand for uniting around this revolutionary program that you're talking about, and like around a revolutionary perspective, and seeing all of these movements together, and the need for organization, the need for, you know, like new democratically accountable leaderships that are prepared to struggle to the end. Like, you know, those protests might start like be triggered by something, but there needs to be some sort of organization to help us win and also maintain it. And it can only be done on a democratic level. And I think it's also crucial to put forward this political alternative that doesn't kind of give this superficial solution, like patchwork solutions, but identifies the root of the problem, which we know is capitalism. We know it's the capitalist system, and we need to put forward an alternative to that, which is socialist alternative. And I think that is also why we're called what we are called. We're called the International Socialist Alternative, because we want to represent this alternative and point how important it is. And even though we spoke about so many different places around the world today, we still have the shout out of the week. So what are we talking about today? What are we highlighting today?
So today, I'm very excited to talk about this because I think it just goes in this theme of a global fight, right? Revolutionary theory and political education is very important to the International Socialist Alternative. So this week, we're going to shout out our Belgian section, LSP or PSL, depending on your language, who have translated and published the first ever Dutch edition of a classic book by Leon Trotsky. Can you guess what it is? I have my copy right here, Revolution Betrayed. It's a classic. They've translated it to Dutch. And I mean, the International Socialist Alternative takes accessibility very seriously, and translations is a huge part of that, which leads me to my next exciting announcement. Drum roll, please. Tenemos un show nuevo de Alternativa Socialista Internacional. That is right, you heard me correctly. Nosotros comenzaremos nuestro show que se llama Un Mundo por Ganar. Nuestros invitados para el primer episodio serán de los Estados Unidos, México y Brasil. Significa que hablaremos en español y portugués y tal vez un poco de portuñol. Empieza el 7 de noviembre a las 3 p.m. en San Paulo, 12 p.m. en la Ciudad de México y a las 8 p.m. en el Estado de España. So next week, we'll be doing a U.S. post-election special, and it will include an exclusive interview with Socialist Alternative City Councilwoman Shama Sawant. So make sure you tune into that. I want to thank everyone who joined us today and all of those who watched. Please subscribe to our channel if you have not, and consider joining the International Socialist Alternative in your area. See you next week, same time, same place. Unless you're watching it in Spanish, we'll see you at a different time. Thanks so much. This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternative's YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!